The door flew open so hard it cracked against the stone wall. Lillian did not stumble in. She walked in with her chin up, her hands pressed flat against her stomach, her eyes burning with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something older and quieter than both, the kind of feeling a woman carries when she has already cried every tear she owns and has nothing left but her spine. The ballroom of Whitmore Manor fell silent. 50 heads turned. Lord Percival Grantham, her former betrothed, stood near the fireplace with a glass of brandy in one hand and a smirk already forming on his lips. He had heard the rumours, of course. Everyone had. The girl he had thrown away was with child. No husband, no name to give it. No future worth speaking of. He laughed, not quietly. Not to himself. He laughed the way men laugh when they believe the whole room belongs to them, loud and slow and full of pleasure at someone else's ruin. "Well," he said, letting his eyes drop to her rounded stomach with open contempt, "it seems you found yourself in quite the mess after all." The room held its breath. Lillian did not flinch. She did not look away. She stood there in the middle of that glittering, cruel room and let him laugh. Let them all stare. Let every whisper wash over her like cold water. Because she knew something none of them knew. The child growing beneath her heart carried a name so powerful that one single letter of it could silence every person in that ballroom for the rest of their natural lives. She had not come here to defend herself. She had come to give Percival Grantham exactly one last look at the woman he had discarded before everything he thought he owned came crashing down around him. Behind her, outside the grand entrance, a black carriage had just rolled to a stop. The crest on its door was unmistakable, and the Duke of Ashfern did not wait to be announced. If you already know this man is about to walk in and turn everything upside down, drop your comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. And if a woman standing tall in her worst moment moves something in you, hit that subscribe button, because this story is only just beginning. The carriage door opened before the footman could reach it. That was the first sign that something was different about tonight. The Duke of Ashfern never moved without ceremony. Every person in London society knew this. He was a man who took his time, who let rooms adjust to his presence before he entered them, who understood that power was not announced, but felt. Yet tonight, his boot hit the gravel before his footman had taken 3 steps, and the great oak doors of Whitmore Manor opened under his hand, like they had been waiting for him all along. The butler at the entrance stepped back so fast he nearly knocked over the candelabra behind him. Inside the ballroom, Lord Percival Grantham was still laughing. He had not noticed the shift in the room yet, the way the music had slowed just slightly, the way the people nearest the entrance had stopped moving, the way even the candle flames seemed to lean in a single direction. He was still enjoying the sight of Lillian standing in the middle of the floor with her rounded stomach and her steady eyes, still tasting the sweetness of her humiliation, still turning to his companions with that loose, careless grin. "No father to speak of," he said to the man beside him, Lord Dunmore Cale, who had the good sense to look slightly uncomfortable. "No name, no prospects. And she walks in here as though she still belongs among decent people." Lady Petronella Finch, who stood 2 feet away with a fan pressed to her lips, made a soft sound that could have been agreement or could have been something else entirely. She was watching the entrance. Percival did not notice. Lillian noticed. She had felt the change the moment the doors opened. Not because she had been waiting for it. She had told herself all evening that she was not waiting for anything, that she had come here on her own terms and would leave the same way. But her body had known before, her mind admitted it, the way her shoulders dropped half an inch, the way her breath came just slightly easier, the way the cold knot in her chest loosened by one single thread. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Percival and let him finish his sentence. And then the room went quiet in a way that was completely different from before. The first silence had been the silence of shock, of people holding their breath to watch a woman be humiliated. The silence was something else. This was the silence of a room full of people who have suddenly realized they are standing in the presence of someone far above their station, and who are now rapidly reviewing every word they have spoken in the last 10 minutes. Percival turned, the glass in his hand tilted. Brandy hit the marble floor. The Duke of Ashfern stood at the top of the 2 shallow steps that led down into the ballroom, and he was not looking at Percival Grantham, and he was not looking at the gathered crowd, and he was not looking at the sparkling chandeliers or the pale faces frozen mid-conversation all around the room. He was looking at Lillian. Only at Lillian. His name was Caius Deverell, and he was the kind of man that history books described in language that never quite captured the truth of him. Tall, yes. Broad through the shoulder, yes. With dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously. But none of that was what made the room go still. What made the room go still was the look on his face, which was not the controlled, distant expression that London society had grown accustomed to. It was something raw and unguarded, and entirely unsuited to a ballroom full of witnesses. He looked at Lillian the way a man looks at something he thought he had lost forever. Percival found his voice first, which was a mistake. "Your Grace," he said, with a laugh that had lost most of its confidence, but was still trying. "What a surprise! We were not expecting you this evening. I am afraid you have arrived in the middle of a rather unfortunate scene. The lady there," he gestured toward Lillian with his glass, forgetting it was now empty, "seems to have lost her way." Caius Deverell descended the 2 steps into the ballroom. He did not look at Percival. He crossed the floor in a straight line, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for something moving with absolute certainty. And he did not slow down, and he did not look left or right. And when he reached Lillian, he stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head to look up at him. She had not let herself look at him in months. She had made herself a rule about it, a firm and necessary rule, and she had kept it through 6 months of whispers and shut doors and mornings spent sick over a cold basin and nights spent staring at the ceiling of her small rented room, wondering what she had done to her life. Now she broke it. She looked up at him, and her throat tightened so fast it nearly choked her. He looked tired, not in the way of a man who had missed sleep, but in the way of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. There were lines near his eyes that she didn't remember, and something in his expression that she couldn't name, something that lived between anger and relief, and something else that frightened her because she didn't want to hope. She could not afford hope. She had not been able to afford it for months. "Lillian," he said. One word. Her name. Spoken quietly, as though they were the only 2 people in the room. She felt it in her chest like a struck bell. "You should not have come," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I know," he said. He did not move. "I came anyway." Behind them, Percival had recovered enough to try again. He stepped forward, and Lady Petronella reached out a hand to stop him, but he shook her off. "Your Grace," he said, louder now, but with an edge of something that wanted to be contempt, but came out sounding more like fear. "Surely you do not mean to involve yourself in this. The woman has no name to give her child, no standing, no claim to anyone in this room. Whatever soft feeling you may have once had for her, this is hardly the occasion to parade it." Caius turned his head then, just his head, slowly. He looked at Percival Grantham for 3 full seconds without speaking, Those 3 seconds did more damage than any speech could have. Percival went pale. "That child," Caius said, in a voice so quiet that the entire room strained forward to hear it, "carries my name." The air left the ballroom. Not a single person moved. Not a fan, not a glass, not a foot. Even the fire in the great hearth seemed to hold itself still. Percival's mouth opened. Nothing came out. No, Lillian closed her eyes. She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it approaching for weeks, like weather felt before it arrived, a pressure in the air, a change in the light. She had told herself she did not want it this way. She had told herself she would handle it quietly, carefully, on her own terms, without spectacle. But there was something she had not accounted for, and that was the feeling of not being alone in a room full of enemies. It moved through her like warmth through cold stone, slow and deep and almost unbearable. She opened her eyes. Caius was looking at her again. "Come," he said, and offered his arm. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She thought about the 6 months she had spent alone. The door that had been shut in her face at his estate by a man she later learned had acted without Caius knowing, or the letter she had written and never sent, the decision she had made in a cold room at dawn to handle this herself. She took his arm, and the crowd that had come here tonight to watch Lillian be broken stepped back in complete silence as the Duke of Ashfern walked her out of Whitmore Manor like she was the only person in the room worth leaving with. Percival Grantham stood in the middle of the ballroom floor with an empty glass and a very new understanding of how badly he had miscalculated. Lady Petronella closed her fan. "Well," she said softly, to no one in particular, "I did wonder." The carriage was warm. That was the first thing Lillian noticed, after the door closed, and the noise of the estate fell away behind them, and the wheels began to move over the gravel drive. It was warm in a way that her rented room had not been for months. There were thick cushions and a small lamp that cast a steady amber light, and outside the window, the dark countryside moved past in silence. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Caius sat across from her. He had not spoken since they left the ballroom. He had guided her to the carriage with one hand at the small of her back, had handed her up himself without waiting for the footman, had settled across from her with a stillness that felt deliberate, like a man forcing himself not to move too fast. She could feel him looking at her. She kept her eyes on the window. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. 6 months, she said. A pause. "When were you going to tell me?" She turned from the window then and looked at him directly, because the question deserved that much. "I tried," she said. "Once. Your man at Deverell House turned me away from the gate. He said you were not receiving visitors of my sort." She watched his face change. I decided after that to manage it alone. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Which man?" he said. "It does not matter now." "It matters considerably." "Caius." His name came out softer than she intended. She saw him react to it, a slight tension through the shoulders, a tightening around the eyes. "I am not here to assign blame. I am here because I had no other reasonable place to be tonight, and that ballroom was not it." "You should not have been in that ballroom at all," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite angry at her. It was more like anger at himself, badly disguised. "I was invited," she said, "or by Lady Dunmore, who I now suspect invited me specifically, so that Percival could have an audience for his performance." Caius was quiet for a moment. "Lady Dunmore is Percival's godmother," he said. "Yes," Lillian said. "I know that now." Outside, the road changed from gravel to packed earth, and the carriage swayed slightly on a gentle curve. The lamp flickered. Lillian pressed her hand to the side of her stomach, a habit now, automatic and unconscious, and she did not realize she had done it until she saw Caius looking at her hand. His expression did something complicated. She moved her hand away. "Don't," he said quietly. She stopped. "Don't take your hand away because I am watching," he said. "Please." She put her hand back. The silence between them changed after that. It did not disappear, but it became something different, or something that had more space in it. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Deverell House," he said. "You will be safe there. I have already sent word ahead." "Caius, I cannot simply move into your home. The talk will be extraordinary." "The talk," he said, with a brief and humorless sound that was almost a laugh, "began the moment I crossed that ballroom floor. There is no quieter path available to us now. I made that choice deliberately. I am not sorry for it." She studied him. He had always been like this, she remembered. Decisive in a way that other men performed, but he simply was. When Caius Deverell made a decision, it was already made before he spoke it. The speaking was only a courtesy to the people around him. It had drawn her to him once, that quality. It also frightened her now, but because she had spent 6 months making her own decisions, and she was not entirely ready to stop. "I am not a problem to be managed," she said. "No," he agreed immediately. "You are not. I will not be installed in your house, like furniture, while you make arrangements about my life without consulting me." "Also fair," he said. "What would you like to be consulted about first?" She blinked. That was not the response she had prepared for. She had prepared for resistance, for the quiet, firm insistence of a powerful man who believed he knew best. She had not prepared for him to simply agree and hand the conversation back to her. He was watching her with that same careful, tired look from the ballroom. "The child's name," she said, because it was the most important thing. "Yes," he said. "You said it in front of everyone. That the child carries your name, because it is true. That is a very large thing to say in public, Caius. It cannot be unsaid. It changes every arrangement either of us might have otherwise made." "I know," he said. "I said it knowing that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You planned this," she said slowly. "You knew I would be there tonight." Something shifted in his expression. "I received a letter," he said carefully. 3 days ago, from someone who thought I should know that Lillian Forsyth, who had been quietly managing a difficult situation alone in a rented room on the edge of Mayfair, had been invited to Whitmore Manor by a woman whose intentions were not kind, and that Lord Grantham intended to use the occasion to ruin whatever small dignity she had left. Lillian felt the warmth in her chest tighten into something that hurt. "Who sent the letter?" she asked. "Your maid," he said. "Dotty." Of course. Of course it had been Dotty, who was 17 and fierce, and had cried silently every time Lillian had come home cold and tired, and had never once said the obvious thing, which was that none of this needed to be borne alone. Lillian pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling of the carriage. "I am going to have words with that girl," she said, but her voice had gone soft. "Please don't," Caius said. "She may have done more good tonight than either of us managed in 6 months." That was true. That was so completely true that Lillian had nothing to say to it. She looked back at him, but in the amber lamplight he looked less like a duke and more like a man, and that was the version of him she had always found most difficult to resist, the version that had sat across from her in a quiet library during a rainy afternoon the previous year, and argued about poetry with complete seriousness, the version that had laughed at something she said, and then looked surprised at himself for laughing, the version that had stood in a garden in early autumn, and looked at her in a way that had rearranged something permanent inside her chest. She had told herself for 6 months that the version of him was a fiction she had invented. "There are things you do not know," she said. "I imagine there are many," he said. "The night we parted. What you were told about me. About why I left the way I did." His expression went carefully. "What was I told?" She studied him. "You don't know." "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, watching the dark road move past the window. "Your brother," she said finally. "Lord Hensley. He came to me 3 days before the dinner where you intended to make your intentions known. He told me that you were already engaged, that arrangements had been made with the Faircastle family, and that your affection for me, while perhaps genuine in its small way, was a private entertainment and nothing more. He suggested, very kindly, that I remove myself before I became an embarrassment to everyone involved." The carriage was so quiet she could hear the horses breathing. "He told you I was engaged," Caius said. "He showed me a letter," she said. "It looked real. I had no reason to disbelieve it. There was no engagement. I know that now. Lillian." "I know," she said, and her voice came out harder than she meant it to. "I know it now. But I didn't know it then, and I was alone, and I was frightened. And when I discovered 6 weeks later that I was carrying your child, the only thing I could think was that if I went to you, your brother would use it to destroy us both. So I made other plans." Caius leaned forward. His elbows went to his knees, and his hands came together, and he looked at the floor of the carriage for several long seconds. When he looked up, his face was something she had never seen on him before. "I looked for you," he said. "For 2 months after you disappeared, I looked. I thought you had gone home to your family in Shropshire. I wrote to your mother. She told me you had not come. I thought something had happened to you. I was in Mayfair," she said very quietly. "I know," he said. "I found that out 4 weeks ago, from Dottie's letter." She absorbed that. 4 weeks. He had known where she was for 4 weeks, and had not come, and she turned that over in her mind, trying to decide what it meant. And then he answered the question she had not yet asked. "I wanted to come immediately," he said. "I was on the road within an hour of reading the letter. And then I stopped, because I realized that arriving at your door and demanding to be let in was not the same as deserving to be let in. I spent 4 weeks trying to determine what I could offer you that was worthy of what you had gone through. I could not work it out." She stared at him. "So instead," she said slowly, "or you let Dottie tell you where I would be tonight, and you came to a ballroom. It seemed more neutral," he said. She almost laughed. The feeling rose in her chest suddenly, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to stop it, because if she started laughing, she was not entirely sure she would not also cry, and she had promised herself months ago that she was done crying in front of anyone, including herself. "Neutral ground," she repeated. "In retrospect," he said, with a look that was the closest thing to sheepish she had ever seen on a duke, "it may not have been my most elegant plan." She lowered her hand. "Your brother," she said, returning to the only thing that actually mattered. "He lied to me deliberately. He drove me away so that you would not make an announcement at that dinner." "Yes," Caius said. "I believe so. Why?" Caius was quiet for a moment. "Because Lord Hensley Deverell has spent 11 years waiting for me to die without an heir, so that he inherits everything," he said, simply and without drama. "A wife would complicate that. A child would end it entirely." The carriage rolled on through the dark countryside. Lillian thought about a man she had met only twice, who had smiled at her in a friendly and unremarkable way, who had handed her a false letter with gentle hands and sympathetic eyes, who had, with one quiet conversation, dismantled 6 months of her life and put a child in danger of having no name. She thought about what it meant that he was now about to learn he had failed. "He will find out," she said. "What happened tonight? Everyone in that ballroom will make sure of it by morning." "Yes," Caius said. "He will not accept it quietly." "No," Caius said. "He will not." The lamplight flickered again as the carriage turned through a gate, and through the window Lillian saw the long drive of Deverell House lit with torches, and the great face of the building ahead, golden-windowed in the dark, and a small cluster of staff already assembled at the door, waiting for her. She had not been waited for in a very long time. "Caius," she said, and stopped. Yes. She turned to look at him one more time before the carriage reached the door, before everything that came next began. "I am glad you came tonight," she said, "even though I am still angry about the 6 months." "You are allowed to be angry," he said. "I intend to spend a significant amount of time making up for them." The carriage stopped, the door opened, and Lillian Forsyth, who had walked into a ballroom alone, with nothing but her spine and a secret that could shake a dynasty, stepped down into the torchlight of Deverell House with the Duke of Ashburn's hand in hers. Above the door, carved in stone, was the Deverell family crest, and somewhere inside the city they had left behind, Lord Hensley Deverell was at this very moment receiving news that was going to ruin the rest of his evening entirely. Lord Hensley Deverell received the news at his card table. The man who brought it was a footman, borrowed from Lady Petronella Finch, who had wasted no time at all. The note was short, 4 lines. Hensley read it once, set it face down on the table, and excused himself from the game with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He walked to his study. He closed the door. He stood at the window and looked out at the London street below, at the carriages moving through the dark, at the lamplight reflected in wet cobblestones, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the nearest object, which happened to be a small marble paperweight, and threw it at the wall. It left a mark. He looked at the mark for a moment, then straightened his cuffs, sat down at his desk, and began to write letters. The first went to his solicitor. The second went to a man whose name appeared in no directory, and whose address was a tavern near the docks. The third went to the Faircastle family, specifically to Lord Faircastle's eldest daughter, Constance, who had been quietly positioned for 2 years as a potential match for Caius, and who Hensley had been carefully cultivating as an alternative solution to his problem. He sealed all 3 letters before the ink on the third was fully dry. Then he sat back in his chair and thought carefully about Lillian Forsyth. He had underestimated her once. She had been a quiet, composed young woman with good manners and no significant family fortune, and he had dismissed her as someone who could be removed with a single, well-crafted lie and a sympathetic expression. He had been right about the removal. He had been wrong about the permanence of it. That would not happen again. In the morning, he decided he would call his brother, not as an enemy, as a concerned and loving brother who had heard alarming rumors and come immediately to offer support and guidance. He was very good at that. Meanwhile, at Deverell House, Lillian was standing in a room that was larger than the entire floor of her rented accommodation in Mayfair, looking at a fire that had been lit in preparation for her arrival, and trying to feel less like a woman who had wandered into someone else's story. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldine Pratt, was a compact woman of about 50, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had shown Lillian to the East Wing guest rooms without a single flicker of surprise or judgment, had introduced her to a lady's maid named Bess, who looked about 20 and had the kind of steady, practical manner that Lillian immediately appreciated, and had asked in a very straightforward way whether Lillian needed anything warm to eat. Lillian had said yes before she finished the question. Now there was soup on the table by the fire, and bread, and a pot of tea, and Lillian was sitting in a chair that was more comfortable than anything she had sat in for half a year, and Bess was quietly unpacking the small bag that had been retrieved from Lillian's rooms by a footman sent ahead. "Mrs. Pratt has been with the family for 22 years, Bess offered, folding something with care. "She is fair and she doesn't gossip. You will have no trouble with her." "Thank you," Lillian said. "And the staff below stairs are loyal to His Grace, not to Lord Hensley," Bess added, which was a more specific reassurance than Lillian had expected. She looked at the girl. Bess kept folding. "We are all aware there is a difference." Lillian wrapped her hands around the teacup and felt the warmth move up through her fingers. Caius had not come upstairs. He had handed her over to Mrs. Pratt in the front hall, with a look that asked a question he did not put into words, and Lillian had answered it by squeezing his hand once and letting go, which seemed to be enough. He had said he would call on her in the morning, and she had nodded, and that had been the end of it. She thought about that now. The squeeze, the nod. How much had been said in it. She pressed her palm to the side of her stomach and felt the small, firm pressure of the child shifting. 6 months ago she had sat in a cold room in Mayfair and told herself that she would protect this child with every single thing she had, which at the time was very little. A small amount of money. A maid named Dotty, who was too young and too loyal for her own good. A name that no longer carried the weight it once had, because her family had quietly turned away from her difficulty to protect themselves. She had not been angry at her family. Not properly. She had understood the arithmetic of it, the way scandal spread and attached itself to everyone nearby. The way a daughter in trouble could become a daughter who was no longer spoken of. She was a little angry now. Not because her circumstances had changed, but because it turned out that someone had been willing to stand in a ballroom full of hostile witnesses and say her child's name out loud, and it had not required armies or miracles. It had only required a man who had decided to stop being careful. She wanted to hold that feeling, but she was also practical enough to know that one dramatic evening didn't resolve 6 months of damage, and that tomorrow would bring its own difficulties, and that Hensley Deverell was already doing something she would not enjoy. She ate the soup. She drank the tea. She was almost asleep in the chair when Bess gently suggested the bed, and Lillian agreed, and the fire was banked low, and the room went quiet, and outside the windows, Deverell House settled around her like something that had been waiting a long time to close. In the morning, it was raining. Lillian woke to the sound of it against the glass, and lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The ceiling was high, the bed was deep and soft. The room smelled of beeswax and old wood, and something faintly floral that she could not identify. She was not in Mayfair. Right. She sat up slowly. Nut and Bess appeared from the adjoining room, with timing that suggested she had been listening for movement. "Good morning," Bess said. "His Grace asks if you will join him for breakfast when you are ready. There is no hurry. He says that twice." Lillian almost smiled. "Tell him I will be down in 20 minutes. She dressed simply, because she had nothing elaborate with her, and Bess arranged her hair with a speed and skill that made Lillian briefly mourn all the mornings she had done it herself in the cloudy mirror of her rented room. She found Caius in a small morning room off the main corridor, standing at the window with a cup of coffee and a letter in his hand. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression settled. The way a person looks when they have been waiting and not entirely sure the wait would end well. "You slept," he said. "I did," she said. better than I have in months, which I am choosing not to examine too closely." He set the letter down on the table, face down, and gestured to the chair across from him. The table had been set for two, with more food on it than either of them could reasonably eat. She sat. She looked at the letter. "Hensley?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not yet. This is from Lord Dunmore Cale. He writes to inform me that last night's scene has been the subject of approximately 4 separate breakfast conversations already this morning, and that opinion is divided." "Divided how?" "Half believe I acted with admirable decisiveness. The other half believe I have taken leave of my senses, and will come to regret it." He picked up his coffee. "Dunmore himself appears to be somewhere in the middle, which for Dunmore is practically a declaration of support." "And Percival?" she asked. Something crossed Caius's face. Percival Grantham has apparently told his version of last night to anyone who would listen, in which he features as a reasonable man who was simply caught off guard by an unexpected scene. "Of course he has," Lillian said. "He also," Caius said, and his voice went slightly quieter, "made certain remarks about you specifically that I am going to need you to tell me about, because I heard only the tail end of them, and I want the full picture before I decide what to do." Lillian poured her tea. "Percival and I were engaged briefly," she said. 18 months ago, before I met you. He broke it off when his father made clear that the Forsyth family's financial position was not what he had assumed. He did it by letter, while I was in the country, and he had already begun paying attention to Constance Faircastle before I received it. Caius was very still. "He was engaged to you," he said. "Briefly," she said. "And badly. I was not heartbroken, if that is what you are about to ask. I was embarrassed, and I was angry for a while, and then I came back to London for the season, and I met you, and I stopped thinking about Percival almost entirely, which probably did not endear me to him. He was in that ballroom last night," Caius said, laughing at the woman he had previously discarded, who he believed had been discarded again. "Yes," Lillian said, "and now he knows he was wrong." "Very wrong," Lillian agreed. Caius set down his cup. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned to read, the working out of something, the measuring of steps. "What, there is something I need to tell you," he said, "about Percival and Hensley." She looked up. "They know each other," he said. "Not casually. They have a financial arrangement. I discovered it 3 weeks ago, when my solicitor found an irregularity in some land papers. Hensley borrowed money from Percival 2 years ago, a significant amount, using land that was not his to use as security. If I marry and produce an heir, Hensley loses his claim to the estate, and he cannot repay what he borrowed, which means Percival loses his money." Lillian set down her own cup very carefully. "So Percival had a reason," she said slowly, "to want me gone. Not only personal wounded pride." "Yes," Caius said. "Hensley and Percival both needed me to disappear." "Yes." She absorbed that. She turned it over. She looked at the shape of the past 6 months from this new angle and saw how the pieces fit. The letter Hensley had brought, the door shut at the estate gate, the invitation from Lady Dunmore to an event designed to finish what the letter had started. "They worked together," she said. "I believe so," Caius said. "And now I am sitting at your breakfast table," she said, "and they know it." "Yes," he said. "Which is why I need you to know all of this before Hensley arrives, because he will arrive today, and he will be charming, and he will try to speak to you alone. And I need you to understand exactly what kind of man you are smiling at." Lillian looked at him across the breakfast table, in the grey morning light, with the rain still moving against the windows. And she thought about a woman who had carried a secret for 6 months, in a cold room, and decided the world was simply arranged against her. She thought about how different it felt to be angry with information instead of alone with confusion. "He will not get me alone," she said. "No," Caius agreed. "He will not." From downstairs there was the sound of the front door. They both looked toward the corridor. Mrs. Pratt's voice, and then another voice, familiar and smooth and pleasant in the way of things designed to be pleasant. Lillian picked up her teacup. "He did not wait until afternoon," she said. "No," Caius said, standing. He did not. Lord Hensley Deverell was, by any ordinary measure, a handsome man. He was 3 years younger than Caius, and carried himself with an ease that other men spent their whole lives practicing. His manners were perfect. His smile arrived at exactly the right moment. He had the kind of face that made people feel trusted, which was the most useful kind of face a dishonest man could have. He came into the morning room with his hat already removed, and an expression of warm, slightly pained concern. "Brother," he said, crossing to grip Caius's hand, "what a night you have had." "I came as soon as I heard. I was worried." "I am sure you were," Caius said. Hensley turned to Lillian, and his expression shifted into something carefully softer. "Miss Forsyth," he said, "I am glad to see you are well. When I heard you had been placed in a difficult situation last night, I was deeply sorry." Lillian looked at him over the rim of her teacup. "Were you?" she said pleasantly. Something very small moved behind his eyes. "Of course," he said. He sat down, because no one had invited him to, and he did it anyway, which told Lillian everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "I want nothing but the best outcome for everyone involved, and I think, if we all sit together calmly, we can find a sensible path forward that does not require any further public spectacle." "What sort of path did you have in mind?" Caius asked. He had not sat. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and his face was entirely neutral, which Lillian now understood was the most dangerous version of him. "Well," Hensley said, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness, "there is the matter of reputation. Miss Forsyth's situation is already the subject of considerable talk. A child outside of marriage is a delicate thing. I wonder if a quiet arrangement, or financial support, comfortable lodging somewhere outside the city, might not be the kindest solution for everyone." Silence. Lillian put her teacup down. "You are suggesting," she said, in a voice of genuine conversational interest, "that the child be hidden, and that I go with it." "I am suggesting comfort and discretion," Hensley said smoothly. "Two things that last night didn't provide. The child," Caius said from the window, "is my heir." "Caius!" Hensley's voice shifted, just slightly, into something with more weight. "You said that last night in a room full of witnesses, and I understand the impulse. I do. But you cannot simply announce something like that without considering the consequences. The family name, the title, the expectations attached to it. A child of uncertain circumstances. However much warmth you feel toward the mother is not the same as a legitimate heir. The circumstances," Caius said, "will be made certain." Hensley looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I intend to marry Miss Forsyth," Caius said, "as quickly as the arrangements can be made." The morning room was very quiet. Hensley's pleasant expression did not fall. It was too much practice for that. But the warmth went out of it, the way a fire goes out when the air is cut off, and what remained was the structure underneath, the careful, calculating architecture of a man who had spent a decade planning for an inheritance and was watching it dissolve in a morning room over breakfast. "That is very sudden," he said. "Not particularly," Caius said. "I have been thinking about it for some time." Hensley turned to Lillian. The smile came back, but it was a different model now. Less warmth, more pressure. "Miss Forsyth," he said, "you are a sensible woman. You must see that this is not a simple matter. My brother is a duke. His marriage affects the entire family, the estate, the tenants, the alliances we have built over generations. A hasty decision made in response to a dramatic evening is not the foundation for any of that." "I agree," Lillian said. He looked almost relieved. "Which is why," she continued, "I would want to be certain that any decision made here is based on complete information, and not on a version of events that has been carefully arranged by people with a financial interest in the outcome." The relief disappeared. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "The letter," Lillian said. "The one you brought me 14 months ago, in which you explained so kindly that your brother was engaged to the Faircastle girl, and that I was a private entertainment and nothing more." Hensley opened his mouth. "There was no engagement," Lillian said. "I know that now. I also know about the money you borrowed from Lord Percival Grantham, secured against land that did not belong to you, and the rather inconvenient arithmetic of what happens to that arrangement if your brother produces an heir." The colour in Hensley's face shifted. Caius had not moved from the window. "I never said anything to harm you personally," Hensley said, and his voice had changed completely now, the pleasantness stripped away, something leaner and harder underneath. "But I made a practical decision to protect the family from a hasty attachment that my brother had not fully considered." "You made a practical decision to protect your inheritance," Lillian said. "They are the same thing." "They are not remotely the same thing," she said. "And I think you know that." Hensley stood up. He buttoned his coat with steady hands, and he looked at Caius. And there was something in that look that was beyond disappointment, and not quite hatred. Something in the middle that was perhaps grief wearing a hard mask. "You would choose her," he said to his brother, not as an accusation, almost as a question. "I would choose her," Caius said. "I chose her 14 months ago when Hensley, you found it necessary to intervene. I am choosing her again now." Something passed over Hensley's face. "The solicitor," he said, it almost to himself. "You already spoke to the solicitor." "Yesterday morning," Caius said, "before I came to Whitmore Manor." Hensley looked at the floor for a moment. Then he straightened and put on the pleasant face again, and it fit worse now, like something returned to the wrong box. "I see," he said. "Then I suppose there is nothing further to discuss." "There is one thing," Caius said. Hensley waited. "The man whose name and address you gave to the person you hired to watch this house," Caius said, "was identified by my steward yesterday evening. The letter he was given is now with my solicitor. I mention this so that you understand the shape of what comes next." Hensley said nothing. "You are my brother," Caius said. "That is not nothing to me. But you have used that position in ways I cannot overlook, and there will be an accounting for it, arranged privately and with as much dignity as I can manage for the sake of the family name. I suggest you speak to your own solicitor before the end of the week." Hensley picked up his hat. He looked at Lillian one more time, and this time there was no performance in it. It was simply a look, measuring and direct, and she met it without flinching. He left. The morning room felt different after he was gone, lighter and colder at the same time, the way a room feels when something heavy has been removed from it. Lillian let out a slow breath. "You knew he would come this morning," she said. "Yes," Caius said. "You wanted me at breakfast so I could hear it directly." "I wanted you at breakfast," he said, moving away from the window at last and sitting down across from her, "was because I did not want to have a conversation about you in your absence. You have had enough of those." She looked at him. He poured himself more coffee, with the calm of a man who had just done something he had been building toward for a very long time. "You said you intend to marry me," she said. "I did," he said. "You didn't ask me." He looked up. A pause. Something moved through his expression that was close to embarrassment. "No," he said. "I did not. You announced it to your brother as though it were already settled." "In my mind," he said carefully, "it is already settled. But I recognize that my mind is not the only one that matters here." "Correct," she said. He set down the coffee. He looked at her across the breakfast table, in the grey morning light, yet with the rain still against the windows and the sound of Hensley's carriage fading down the drive, and his expression was the one she had seen in the ballroom, unguarded and entirely unduke-like. "Lillian," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It was not quite a statement. It lived in the space between them where most of the important things had lived since the beginning. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, alone and frightened, and making plans in the dark. She thought about who she was now, still frightened in places, still angry in places, but no longer alone, and no longer making plans only for survival. She thought about the child, who deserved a name, and a father, and a house that did not have a cold draft under the door. She also thought about herself, and whether she wanted this, truly, out beyond the practicalities, whether she could trust what she felt in her chest when she looked at him. She could. That was the simple and terrifying truth of it. "Yes," she said. He did not smile immediately. He looked at her for a moment first, as though making sure the word was real. Then something in his whole face shifted, released, became something warmer and less careful than anything she had seen on him before. "Good," he said. Outside, the rain was already beginning to ease. Somewhere across the city, Percival Grantham was waking to a morning that had become significantly more complicated than he had planned for. And in a study near the docks, a man with no name in any directory was reading a letter that had not yet reached the person it was intended to warn, because the steward at Deverell House had intercepted it the previous evening, and it was now sitting in a locked drawer alongside everything else that was being quietly assembled against the 2 men who had spent over a year trying to erase a woman from a story she had every right to be in. Dotty arrived at Deverell House that afternoon, with a bundle under each arm and her chin in the air, and when Lillian came down to meet her in the hall, Dotty looked at the house, and then at Lillian, and then at the house again. "Right then," Dotty said. "This is better." Lillian laughed. It came out before she could stop it, full and real and slightly startled, the laugh of a woman who had forgotten for a while that she was someone who laughed. Mrs. Pratt appeared from the corridor, looked at them both, and allowed herself the smallest possible smile before returning to whatever she had been doing. "Come in," Lillian said to Dotty. "Come in and I will tell you everything. And then I am going to be very calm and measured when I explain to you that writing letters to dukes without telling me is not something we will be repeating." "It worked, didn't it?" Dotty said, completely unrepentant, stepping through the door. It had. It had worked entirely. The bans were read on a Thursday. By Friday morning, London had opinions. Mrs. Aldine Pratt brought the newspapers to Lillian with her breakfast tray, and the particular expression of a woman who has read them already, and is prepared to stand between her charge and their contents if necessary. Lillian thanked her, unfolded the first one, and read it with her tea going cold beside her. And the society pages were, predictably, spectacular. One paper described the scene at Whitmore Manor with the breathless detail of someone who had been there and taken notes. Another ran a small column speculating on the speed of the upcoming marriage and what it implied about the timeline of events. A third, which Lillian suspected had received assistance from someone connected to Hensley, ran a piece questioning the suitability of the match and the wisdom of a duke, making permanent decisions under emotional pressure. She folded them all and set them aside. Dotty, who had been reading over her shoulder with no shame whatsoever, made a sound of deep disgust at the third paper. Emotional pressure, Dotty repeated. He walked across a ballroom. That is not emotional pressure. That is a man with a functioning conscience. It is also a man with a brother who knows how to play stories, Lillian said. What are you going to do about it? Lillian looked out the window at the Deverell House garden, where the rain of the previous days had left everything washed and bright. A gardener was moving along the far wall, doing something careful with the climbing roses. Nothing today, she said. Today I have a fitting, a meeting with Caius's solicitor, and apparently a call from Lady Dunmore Cale, who has sent a note expressing a desire to offer her personal apology, which I will believe when I see it. Dotty snorted. Lady Dunmore doesn't apologize. She repositions. Exactly, Lillian said. So I will smile, and I will listen, and I will let her think she has successfully repositioned, and then I will remember everything she says. Dotty looked at her with the expression she sometimes wore when Lillian surprised her. You have changed, Dotty said, not unkindly. 6 months will do that, Lillian said. The solicitor's name was Mr. Crispin Vale, and he was a small, dry man who communicated entirely in precise sentences, and had the eyes of someone who had seen every version of human foolishness and was no longer capable of being surprised by any of it. He arrived at 11, spread a considerable number of documents across the library table, and proceeded to explain to Lillian, with Caius beside her, exactly what the marriage settlement would contain. It was thorough. It was, in fact, more thorough than Lillian had expected, and after the third page she looked at Caius and said, Did you write these terms yourself? With Mr. Vale's guidance, Caius said. There is a provision here, she said, pointing, that places a portion of the Deverell Eastern properties in a trust that I control independently. Yes, Caius said. That is not standard. No, he said. It is not. Mr. Vale cleared his throat in the manner of a man who has decided not to have feelings about any of this, and is succeeding through effort. It also provides, Caius said, that in any circumstance in which you find yourself in the position you were in 6 months ago, you will not be in that position without resources, regardless of what happens between us. Lillian looked at the document. She thought about the cold room in Mayfair, and the money she had counted, and recounted on the desk, and the decisions she had made with arithmetic and fear. You are trying to make certain, she said slowly, that I chose you without needing to. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. That is either very romantic or very complicated, she said. I believe it is both, Mr. Vale offered, in a tone suggesting he had not intended to say that out loud. Lillian signed the documents. Lady Dunmore Cale arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a carriage that announced itself before it stopped, and she came into the drawing-room with the energy of a woman who has decided that the best defense is an overwhelming offense of charm. She was 60, sharp-eyed, beautifully dressed, and she kissed Lillian on both cheeks as though they were old friends. My dear, she said, settling into the chair across from Lillian with the ease of someone who sat in other people's best chairs professionally, I owe you an explanation. Do you? Lillian said. I invited you to Whitmore Manor knowing what Percival intended, Lady Dunmore said, with a directness that was either honesty or a very sophisticated performance of it. I want you to know that I did not expect it to go as far as it did. I thought he would make a quiet remark, you would be uncomfortable, you would leave. I did not anticipate the level of public display he chose. I see, Lillian said. So you arranged the ambush, but objected to the execution. Lady Dunmore had the grace to look slightly pained. when you say it that way. How would you say it? A pause. Lady Dunmore looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with great composure. I would say, she said carefully, that I made a decision based on information I was given by a man I trusted, and that I have since revised my opinion of that man considerably. Percival, Lillian said. And others, Lady Dunmore said. Something in her tone suggested she meant Hensley, and that her revised opinion of him was not gentle. Lillian studied her. Lady Dunmore was not a good woman in the simple sense. She was a powerful woman, which was a different thing entirely, and she moved through the world by managing alliances rather than holding principles. But there was something in her expression now that looked like genuine discomfort, and Lillian had learned to distinguish genuine discomfort from the performed kind. What do you want? Lillian asked. Lady Dunmore looked up. To be on the right side of this, she said simply. I am 60 years old, and I have been on the wrong side of things before, and it has never been worth it. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then be useful, she said. Percival is telling his version of that evening to anyone who will listen. The newspaper this morning carried a story that came from Hensley's direction. If you want to be on the right side has a story too, and it needs someone who knows how to tell it in the right rooms. Lady Dunmore's eyes lit up in the way of a woman who has just been handed something she is extremely good at. Leave that to me, she said. She stayed for 40 minutes and left with purpose in her step, and Dotty, who had listened from the adjoining room without apology, appeared in the doorway immediately after. You just hired Lady Dunmore Cale, Dotty said. I gave her something useful to do, Lillian said, which is not quite the same thing, but the result will be similar. That evening, Caius found her in the library. She had not been looking for him. She had come to find a particular book she remembered seeing on the shelves 2 days earlier, a collection of letters from the previous century that she had half read before other things claimed her attention. She had found it, and then she had sat down in the chair nearest the fire, and the book had opened in her lap, and she had not read a single word of it because she was thinking. Caius came in quietly, saw her, and stopped. I am not interrupting? He asked. I am not reading, she said. You are not interrupting. He came and sat in the chair across from hers, which was becoming a pattern, the two of them on opposite sides of things, talking across the space between. You are worried, he said. I am thinking, she said. Yet about what? She considered how to say it. About the difference, she said, between a situation that has been resolved and a situation that is still in motion. He waited. Hensley has not done what you fear he will do yet, she said. He has only done what we know about. The letter he sent to the man near the docks, whatever he said to Percival after that night. There are things moving that we cannot see clearly, and I am aware that feeling safe in this house is not the same as being safe. You are right, Caius said. I am not asking you to reassure me, she said. I am asking you to tell me what you know and what you are doing about it, because I am done being the person that things happen to without being told. He nodded once. Mr. Vale, he said, or is in communication with a barrister named Thorne, who specializes in the kind of financial irregularities Hensley has committed. The land papers are being reviewed. The money borrowed from Percival was secured fraudulently, and the agreement is likely unenforceable, which means Percival is also in a difficult position. They are bound together in this, which is both their strength and their problem. And the man near the docks, she asked. No longer a concern, Caius said, in a tone that closed that particular door without slamming it. Lillian absorbed that. There is something else, she said. Constance Faircastle. Caius looked at her steadily. What about her? She was positioned as a potential match for you by Hensley. She may not have known the full nature of that arrangement. She may be as much a piece moved on a board as I was. Caius was quiet for a moment. That is a generous interpretation, he said. It is an accurate one, Lillian said. I would like to meet her. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as the one he wore when she did something that surprised him in a way he approved of. I will arrange it, he said. She nodded and looked back at the fire. There is one more thing, she said quietly. Yes. When this is over. When Hensley is dealt with, and the papers are settled, and the wedding is done, and the child is born, and the talk has moved on to someone else's difficulty. She paused. I want to go to Shropshire. He was still. My family, she said. My mother. They turned away when things were hard. I understand why. I am not certain I have forgiven it yet. But I want to go when all of this is stable, and I want to see them, and I want my mother to see the child. She did not look at him while she said it. Whenever you are ready, he said. We will go. The fire crackled. Outside, the garden was dark, and somewhere in the city, in a study she had never seen, Hensley Deverell was making his last set of calculations, running out of moves on a board he had thought he controlled, and beginning to understand the shape of how this ended. Lillian opened the book in her lap. This time she read. The wedding was on a morning when the light came through the chapel windows, in long, flat sheets that turned everything gold. It was not a large ceremony. Caius had offered one, had said that if she wanted the full weight of a ducal wedding, he would arrange it. And she had looked at him and said that what she wanted was to be married before the child arrived, which gave them approximately 6 weeks, and that a small chapel with a short guest list suited her considerably better than a spectacle. He had agreed with a speed that suggested he preferred it too. The guest list was 17 people. Mr. Vale was there, looking as though he had not expected to be invited and had decided to treat the occasion with the same careful neutrality he brought to all documents. Mrs. Pratt stood near the back in her best dress, which was nearly identical to her ordinary dress, but pressed with greater intention. Dotty cried from the second row and denied it afterward to everyone, including herself. Lord Dunmore Cale came, which surprised Lillian, and brought his wife, which surprised her more, and Lady Dunmore herself arrived in a state of barely contained social satisfaction at having been correct about where this was all heading. Constance Faircastle sat near the end of the third row. Lillian had met her 10 days earlier in the small sitting room off the library, and had found a young woman of about 22 who had indeed known nothing of the full arrangement Hensley had constructed, who had been told only that the Duke of Ashburn was a suitable prospect her family was considering, and who had seemed more relieved than disappointed to learn that the situation had resolved itself in a different direction. They talked for an hour. They had, to Lillian's genuine surprise, found each other agreeable. Constance had come to the wedding because Lillian had asked her to, which was either an act of great confidence or great absurdity, and which Constance had accepted with the kind of straightforward courage that Lillian had decided to appreciate rather than question. Hensley was not there. He had sent a letter 3 days before the wedding, addressed to Caius, which Caius had read alone and then described to Lillian in brief and careful terms. The letter acknowledged the legal proceedings that Mr. Vale and the barrister Thorne had set in motion. It acknowledged the fraudulent land arrangement with Percival. It made no apology, but it made an offer, a full accounting of the financial irregularities in exchange for a private resolution that kept the matter out of the courts and therefore out of the newspapers. Caius had accepted, not because Hensley deserved it, but because the family name was also the child's name now, and the child had not chosen any of this. Lillian had agreed with that reasoning, though it had taken her a full day and a long walk in the Deverell House garden to get there. Percival Grantham had received a separate legal communication from Mr. Vale regarding the fraudulent security on his loan, which rendered the arrangement unenforceable, and the debt effectively restructured on terms that were not in Percival's favour. He had not attended the wedding. He had also not attended anything in London society for the past 2 weeks, which Lady Dunmore reported with a satisfaction she did not attempt to conceal. The chapel smelled of beeswax and early roses. Lilian stood at the altar and looked at Caius. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in the carriage that first night, when she had pressed her hand to the side of her stomach, and he had asked her not to take it away. She had thought then that she could not afford hope. She thought now that she had been wrong about what hope cost. She had been calculating it like a debt, something to be paid eventually with disappointment. She had not understood that sometimes it simply arrived and stood in front of you in a chapel with gold light coming through old windows and waited for you to meet it. She met it. The words were simple and old, and she meant every one of them, and when it was done, and Caius put his hand under her chin and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, she heard Dotty make a sound that was absolutely crying, regardless of what anyone said later. But they signed the register in the small room off the altar, and Mr. Vale witnessed it with the expression of a man who has handled the legal architecture of this entire situation and is experiencing something that might technically be described as pride, and Mrs. Pratt produced a handkerchief from somewhere and used it once and replaced it with great dignity. Outside the chapel, the morning was bright. Caius kept her hand as they came down the steps, and she let him, and the small cluster of guests came out behind them into the light, and Lady Dunmore said something to Lord Dunmore that made him laugh, which was apparently a rare enough event that several people turned to look. Dotty appeared at Lilian's other side. "Well," Dotty said, with the air of someone reviewing completed work. "That went well." "It did," Lilian agreed. "Better than the ballroom. Most things are better than the ballroom." "I stand by the letter," Dotty said. "Just for the record." Lilian turned and looked at her. This girl who was 17 and fierce and had written to a duke on her employer's behalf without permission and without apology, and had changed the entire shape of things. "I know you do," Lilian said. "You were right to write it." Dotty's expression went briefly soft, the way it did when she had been hoping for something and received it. Then she straightened and became businesslike again. "The carriage is ready," she said, "and I packed everything this morning, and Mrs. Pratt has the house arrangements in hand. And I have left very clear instructions about the temperature of your room because nobody seems to understand that it needs to be warmer than the rest of the house, which you would think would be obvious given the circumstances." "Thank you, Dotty," Lilian said. They drove back to Deverell House through streets that had no idea anything significant had happened, which Lilian found quietly perfect. The world continued its own business, horses and carriages, and people with errands and purposes. None of them knew that 6 months ago a woman had sat in a cold room and counted money and made plans alone, and that those plans had bent and broken and reformed into something she would not have designed herself, and could not now imagine trading for anything. At Deverell House, Mrs. Pratt had arranged a small celebration in the dining room, though not a dinner party. A table set with more food than 17 people could eat, and flowers from the garden, and the household staff assembled briefly to offer quiet congratulations before returning to their work with a collective air of satisfaction. Lilian sat at the head of the table she had first entered as a guest, and felt the difference in her spine. Later, when the guests had gone, and the house had settled, and Dotty had finally been persuaded to stop reorganizing things and go to her room, Lilian found herself again in the library. This had become her place in the house, she realized. Not by assignment, but by habit, the way bodies find the rooms that suit them. Caius found her there, as he always did, and he came and sat across from her as he always did, and the fire was steady, and the house was quiet around them. "Or Shropshire," he said. She looked up. "In 3 weeks," he said, "when you are comfortable to travel, I have written to your mother." She stared at him. "You wrote to my mother?" "I introduced myself," he said, with the careful tone of a man who is aware he may have overstepped, and has done it anyway, because he calculated it was worth it. "I told her that her daughter is well, and that we were recently married, and that we intend to visit when the time is right." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "How did you word it?" she asked. "Carefully," he said. "Did you say anything about how she behaved? About leaving me without support?" "No," he said. "I said that her daughter had shown more courage and dignity in 6 difficult months than most people manage in a lifetime, and that I considered myself fortunate to know her." Lillian pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to cry in front of him. She had made herself a rule about it. "Caius," she said, when she trusted her voice. "Yes." "That was very well done." He looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, the expression that lived in the space between, where most of the important things lived. "I am learning," he said, "from a woman who does most things well." Outside, London moved on through the evening, indifferent and bright, carrying its ordinary business and its extraordinary gossip, and its 1,000 small dramas that mattered enormously to the people inside them. Inside Deverell House, in a library with a steady fire, a woman who had walked into a ballroom alone with nothing but a secret, and a spine sat with her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, and looked at the man across from her, and understood, fully and without reservation, that the story she had thought was falling apart had simply been finding its shape. 3 weeks later they went to Shropshire. Lillian's mother opened the door before the carriage had fully stopped, and she stood on the step of the small family house and looked at her daughter, and then at the Duke of Ashburn behind her, and then at her daughter again, and something in her face moved through several expressions, too quickly to name before settling on the one that was the truest. She came down the steps and took Lillian's hands in both of hers. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Art, you look well." "I am well," Lillian said. Her mother's hands tightened. "I am sorry," her mother said, very quietly, so that only Lillian could hear it. "I am so sorry, my girl." Lillian looked at her mother's face, which was older than she remembered, which was always the way of things when time has been difficult, and she thought about what it cost a woman to say that word out loud when pride and fear and the arithmetic of survival had been in the way of it for months. She squeezed her mother's hands back. "I know," she said. "Come and meet him properly." Behind them, on the road, a child who had not yet arrived was nonetheless already changing the shape of every room it would ever enter, the way children do before anyone has thought to ask their opinion about it. 6 weeks later, in the east bedroom of Deverell House, on a morning that started before sunrise and finished well after it, that child arrived. A boy. Dark-haired, astonishingly loud, and entirely unimpressed with the grandeur of his surroundings, which Caius said was a good sign, and Mrs. Pratt agreed with completely. Dotty sat outside the door for the entire duration, and refused to move for any reason, including the 3 separate occasions on which she was offered food. When Lillian finally held him and looked down at the furious, scrunched, extraordinary face of the heir to the Deverell dukedom, she thought about Percival Grantham laughing in a ballroom. She thought about a cold room in Mayfair, and a letter she had never sent, and a door that had been shut in her face, by a man following someone else's instructions. She thought about how small and certain this felt now. Against all of that, there she looked up. Caius was watching her from the chair beside the bed, with the expression that no longer surprised her, the one she had finally named correctly after weeks of looking at it. It was simply love. That was all. The uncomplicated, inconvenient, persistent kind that had walked across a ballroom and announced itself in front of 50 witnesses and had not apologized for any of it. "He needs a name," she said. "He does," Caius agreed. "Something that does not belong to anyone who has caused us trouble," she said. "Something that is only his." "I was thinking," Caius said carefully, "Edmund is a fine name, but you may have opinions." "Edmund is good," she said. "Edmund Caius Deverell." Caius looked at her. "You do not have to," he said. "I know," she said, "what I want to." The baby made a sound that was not quite agreement, and not quite protest, and Dottie, who had absolutely been listening through the door, could be heard making a noise in the corridor that she would later describe as a cough. Mrs. Pratt appeared with tea that no one had asked for, and everyone needed, and Caius took the tray from her and set it on the table and poured a cup and brought it to Lillian himself, which Mrs. Pratt observed with the expression of a woman who has watched this family for 22 years and is satisfied with how this particular chapter has ended. Outside, London did not know. It would find out soon enough, because it always did. And the announcement would travel through drawing rooms and breakfast tables and society pages with the speed that good news travels, when it is also the kind of news that makes a particular group of people feel the specific discomfort of having been entirely wrong. But inside Deverell House that morning, none of that had happened yet. There was only the room, and the fire, and the tea, and a boy who did not know his own name yet, and two people who had found each other twice, and had decided that twice was enough to be certain. Lillian drank her tea. The baby slept, and in Shropshire, in a small house on a quiet road, a grandmother was already packed and waiting for the letter that was even now being written by a duke who had learned in the past several months that the people who love someone deserve to be told when she is well. She was well. She was, in fact, more than well. She was exactly where the story had always been going, even in the months when it looked like it was going nowhere good at all. And if you have sat with this story from that first night in the ballroom all the way to this quiet morning, you already know that the most important moment was never the one that was loudest. It was the one where a woman who had nothing left but her spine walked through a door and refused to be small. Did she make the right choice trusting him again, or would you have walked away? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved something in you, please hit the subscribe button, because there is so much more where this came from.